Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping carefully into one of the strangest, most forbidden, and most unsettling mysteries ever hidden inside the ancient world of the Bible. A mystery about a name that almost never appears in church, a being so powerful, so mysterious, and so dangerously close to the throne of heaven that ancient rabbis once feared even speaking about him openly could threaten the very foundation of their faith. For most of my life, I thought I already knew the great figures of Scripture: Moses, Abraham, Elijah, Michael, Gabriel. The names repeated across the sacred pages since childhood, the names every believer recognizes almost instantly. But then, late one night, while wandering through forgotten Jewish traditions, ancient mystical writings, and old commentaries buried beneath centuries of silence, I came across a name that stopped me completely: Metatron, a name missing from nearly every modern Bible, uh, and yet somehow hidden behind passages many of us have read our entire lives without ever noticing what might be standing beneath them. A being seated beside the throne of the Almighty, carrying the divine name within himself, speaking with the authority of God, walking silently through the Old Testament like a shadow no one was supposed to recognize. And honestly, the deeper I looked, the stranger everything became, because ancient rabbis seemed deeply afraid of this figure. Some believed he was the angel of the Lord, the mysterious presence inside the burning bush, the voice that stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, the unseen guide leading Israel through the wilderness beneath pillars of fire and cloud. Others believed he was something even more dangerous: a heavenly mediator, a visible manifestation of the invisible God, a being so close to divine authority that some ancient teachers feared humanity might mistake him for a second power in heaven itself. And once I started tracing these ancient passages carefully for myself, slowly, verse by verse, pattern by pattern, I could understand why they were afraid, because once you begin seeing the connections, it becomes almost impossible to stop seeing them. The angel who speaks as God, the mysterious figure standing upon sapphire, the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, the heavenly being carrying the divine name. Again and again, the same shadow seems to move beneath the surface of Scripture. And tonight, I do not want us to approach this mystery like cold historians, or skeptics searching for arguments, or people trying to force certainty onto questions older than empires themselves. Instead, I want us to walk through these ancient texts together, slowly, slowly, carefully, almost like travelers carrying a small lantern through forgotten corridors hidden beneath history itself. We will explore the hidden traditions surrounding Metatron, the angel whose name faded into silence, the man some believed became more than human, the heavenly figure seated beside the throne, and the terrifying controversy ancient rabbis called two powers in heaven. We will follow the mystery through Sinai, through Daniel, through Enoch, through the throne visions of heaven, and eventually toward a final question so unsettling that religious authorities spent centuries trying to contain its implications. Why did so many ancient teachers become terrified of this name? And perhaps even more importantly, what if traces of this figure were never truly removed at all? What if they remained hidden in plain sight, scattered quietly across the pages of Scripture this entire time? Because sometimes the most dangerous mysteries are not the ones erased from history, but the ones hidden so carefully that generations stop noticing they were there at all. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, dim the lights softly around you, settle slowly into the darkness, let the noise of the modern world drift quietly away. And together, let us begin tracing the forgotten shadow of the being ancient texts once called Metatron. I grew up believing I already knew the important names of the Bible. The names felt familiar, almost permanent, like ancient mountains that had always existed in the distance of human history: Moses, Abraham, Isaiah, David, Michael, Gabriel. The figures repeated again and again across sermons, paintings, prayers, and childhood memories. And for most of my life, I never questioned whether there were other names hidden deeper beneath the surface of Scripture itself, names forgotten, or perhaps names deliberately pushed into silence. Because if someone had asked me years ago whether I knew every major heavenly figure connected to the Bible, I probably would have said yes without hesitation. And yet, somehow, through all those years of reading Scripture, studying biblical history, and listening to religious teachings, I had never once heard the name Metatron. Not once. I remember the exact feeling when I first encountered it. It was late at night, the kind of quiet hour where the world almost feels suspended between sleep and thought. And I had fallen into one of those strange research spirals that begins innocently enough, reading old commentaries, tracing references through ancient texts, opening one forgotten manuscript after another, and then suddenly, there it was, Metatron. The name itself felt strange, ancient, almost forbidden, not like Michael, not like Gabriel. There was something heavier about it, something unsettling. And what disturbed me even more was realizing how difficult it was to find clear explanations about him inside mainstream religious teaching. Because the deeper I searched, the stranger the silence became. The Talmud mentioned him. Ancient mystical Judaism mentioned him repeatedly. Merkabah traditions described him in terrifying detail. Some rabbis called him the Prince of the Presence, others associated him with the angel of the Lord. Some even connected him to the throne of heaven itself. And yet, when I turned back to the modern Bible, nothing, no clear mention, no direct explanation. Almost like the name itself had vanished from the center of the story, while traces of the figure remained scattered quietly beneath the text. That realization genuinely unsettled me, because it created a question I could not escape afterward. If this figure was so important, why was the name erased? I remember sitting there staring at the screen, rereading ancient passages over and over again, feeling that strange sensation you experience when something hidden suddenly begins revealing its outline in the darkness. Because once the name entered my mind, I started noticing patterns everywhere. The angel who speaks as God, the mysterious being carrying the divine name, the visible presence standing within the burning bush, the heavenly figure seated beside the throne, again and again. The same shadow seemed to move quietly beneath the surface of Scripture, and yet the name itself remained strangely absent. That absence became more disturbing than the mystery itself, because religious history rarely forgets powerful figures accidentally, especially figures connected to divine authority. Silence that complete usually means something else: fear, suppression, theological danger. And the deeper I traveled into ancient Jewish mystical traditions, the more that feeling intensified. Some rabbis treated discussions about Metatron almost cautiously, as though speaking too openly about him risked crossing a dangerous line. Others warned against misunderstandings that could threaten the absolute unity of God. There were stories of teachers condemned for seeing too much. Mystics warned about heavenly mysteries ordinary minds were not prepared to approach. The atmosphere surrounding the subject felt less like ordinary theology and more like hidden fire, forbidden theology, something intentionally concealed beneath centuries of careful silence. I found myself imagining ancient rabbis sitting in dimly lit chambers surrounded by scrolls, whispering debates late into the night. Fearful not because Metatron was unimportant, but because he might have been too important, too close to divine authority, too close to the throne, too difficult to explain safely. And honestly, once that possibility entered my mind, the Bible itself began feeling different to me, almost layered, like there was the visible text everyone reads openly, and beneath it, another pattern hidden quietly between the lines. A shadow moving through the Old Testament unnoticed unless someone knows where to look. That feeling stayed with me constantly after that first discovery, because the mystery surrounding Metatron was not simply about one forgotten name. It was about why certain names disappear at all, why some traditions survive openly, while others fade into whispers and fragments buried at the edges of history. And perhaps most unsettling of all, why traces of this figure still seem to remain scattered across Scripture, almost like fingerprints left behind after someone tried very carefully to erase the evidence of his existence. The deeper I looked, the more impossible it became to ignore one terrifying possibility. Maybe Metatron was never fully removed from the story. Maybe only the name disappeared, while the shadow itself remained hidden in plain sight this entire time. The deeper I followed the mystery surrounding Metatron, the more I realized something even stranger than the missing name itself. The Bible already seemed to contain a figure who behaved in ways no ordinary angel ever should. At first, I tried to ignore the pattern. Honestly, I wanted simpler explanations, safer explanations. Because growing up, I had always imagined angels as messengers, servants, beings who carried words from heaven but never spoke with divine authority themselves. They delivered messages, they obeyed commands, they pointed toward God, but they were never confused with God. At least, that is what I always believed. Until I began rereading certain passages slowly, careful almost as if I were seeing them for the first time. And suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It begins in Genesis 16. Hagar, alone in the wilderness, abandoned, terrified, pregnant, crying beneath the emptiness of the desert sky. The text says the angel of the Lord appears to her, not God. The angel of the Lord, a messenger, an intermediary, at least that is how the story begins. But then something strange happens. After speaking with this being, Hagar responds by saying, "You are the God who sees me," not messenger of God, not servant of God, God. I remember rereading that verse several times in disbelief because the text never corrects her. It never says she misunderstood. Instead, the narrative almost flows naturally between the angel of the Lord and God himself, as though the distinction becomes strangely blurred. And once I noticed it there, I started seeing the same thing everywhere. Genesis 22. Abraham stands on Mount Moriah with Isaac, the knife raised, the sacrifice moments away. Then the angel of the Lord calls out from heaven to stop him. Again, the scene begins normally enough, an angel speaking, but then the voice says something deeply unsettling. "You have not withheld your only son, from me." From me. Not from God. From me. I remember sitting in silence after reading that line, because suddenly the figure speaking no longer sounded like an ordinary angelic messenger at all. The being speaks with divine ownership, divine authority, almost as though the voice itself stands in the place of God. And then came Exodus 3, the burning bush, the passage that genuinely changed everything for me. Because at the beginning of the scene, the text explicitly says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush." Clear enough, an angel, but only a few lines later, without warning, the narrative suddenly shifts. God called unto him out of the midst of the bush. No explanation, no transition, no clarification. The angel of the Lord appears. um, appears. Then suddenly, it is God speaking directly from the fire. I remember feeling an actual chill when I noticed how casually the text moves between the two identities, as though the ancient writers themselves saw no contradiction in it. And honestly, that was the moment something inside me changed, because this wasn't behaving like a normal angel anymore, not even close. This figure speaks with authority, receives reverence, carries the divine name, appears visibly, yet somehow represents the invisible God himself. And once that realization settled into my mind, I understood why ancient rabbis became so fascinated and so afraid of these passages, because they noticed this pattern long before modern readers ever did. Ancient Jewish interpreters wrestled deeply with the mysterious identity of the angel of the Lord. Some believed this figure represented a visible manifestation of divine presence. Others connected him to heavenly mediation. Some mystical traditions eventually associated these passages with Metatron himself, the prince of the presence, the being nearest to the throne. And honestly, Once I began tracing these connections, the Old Testament started feeling layered in a way I ever experienced before. Almost as though beneath the surface of familiar stories, another hidden narrative had been moving quietly all along. A visible heavenly mediator walking through Scripture unnoticed by most readers, the angel in the wilderness, the voice in the fire, the figure stopping Abraham, again and again, the same strange presence emerging from the shadows. And perhaps what disturbed me most was not simply the pattern itself, but how openly it existed inside the biblical text. This was not hidden deep in obscure mystical writings. These were passages millions of people had read for centuries, yet somehow the implications often passed unnoticed, or perhaps intentionally unexplored. Because once you begin asking who this angel truly is, the theological tension becomes immediate. How can God remain invisible and yet appear visibly? How can a messenger speak as God himself? How can the angel of the Lord receive reverence without correction? The deeper I followed the pattern, the more impossible the questions became to ignore. And somewhere beneath all those ancient passages, hidden beneath centuries of sermons and translations and familiar readings, I began sensing the outline of something the ancient rabbis themselves had recognized long ago, a heavenly figure dangerously close to divine identity itself, a mystery ancient Judaism struggled to explain safely, and perhaps the very same shadow that later generations would eventually call Metatron. There was one verse, one single passage buried inside Exodus that changed the entire direction of this journey for me. Not because it was hidden, not because it came from an obscure mystical manuscript, but because it was sitting openly inside the Bible itself, waiting quietly beneath words I had somehow read for years without fully noticing their implications. Exodus 23, at first, the passage seems simple enough. God tells Israel that an angel will go before them through the wilderness, guiding them toward the promised land, a divine messenger, a heavenly protector, nothing unusual. At least, that is what I thought. Until I slowed down and actually read the words carefully. Behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Still normal, but then the passage continues. Beware of him and obey his voice, provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. I remember the exact moment those words hit me, my name is in him. And honestly, this was the verse that genuinely unsettled me, because nowhere else in Scripture is an angel described in quite this way. Not Michael, not Gabriel, not any ordinary messenger of heaven. This being carries the divine name itself. And in ancient Jewish thought, the name of God was not merely a label. It represented presence, authority, identity, power, the very essence of divine reality revealed to creation. Ancient scribes treated the name with terrifying reverence. Some traditions refused to pronounce it aloud. Others purified themselves before writing it. And now, here in Exodus, God says something almost impossible to ignore. My name is in him. Not with him, not spoken through him, in him. I remember staring at the passage in silence, feeling a strange heaviness building in my chest, because the implications seemed enormous once I stopped rushing past the words. This angel does not behave like an ordinary servant. Israel is commanded to obey him as though obeying God himself, not merely respect him, obey him. And then comes the line that disturbed me even more. He will not pardon your transgressions. That sentence genuinely changed how I saw the passage, because forgiveness of sins belongs to divine authority. Throughout Scripture, sin is ultimately against God, and yet this being possesses authority connected to judgment and forgiveness itself. What kind of angel carries that kind of power? The deeper I reflected on it, the stranger the entire passage became. This angel guides Israel, carries the divine name, exercises authority over sin, receives obedience equivalent to obedience toward God himself. And somehow, the text treats all of this almost casually, as though the ancient audience already understood the theological framework behind it. But I didn't, at least not yet. And honestly, That realization unsettled me deeply because suddenly the mystery surrounding the angel of the Lord no longer felt isolated to a few strange passages. Now the pattern was expanding. The burning bush, Mount Moriah, the wilderness angel. Again and again, the same impossible tension kept appearing. A visible heavenly figure carrying divine authority while remaining distinct from the invisible God. I remember searching through ancient rabbinic interpretations afterward, almost hoping someone had a simple explanation that would make the tension disappear. But instead, I discovered something even stranger. The ancient rabbis themselves wrestled intensely with this verse. Some mystical traditions connected this angel directly to Metatron, the Prince of the Presence, the heavenly mediator carrying the divine name, and suddenly the old mystical title surrounding Metatron took on entirely new meaning. Bearer of the name, not symbolic, literal, the being through whom divine authority manifests visibly within creation. The more I studied those traditions, the more emotionally charged the passage became for me. Because once the name enters the conversation, the stakes change completely. Uh, this is no longer merely about angels. It becomes about how divine presence itself interacts with humanity, how the invisible God reveals authority visibly without ceasing to remain transcendent. And perhaps that is why ancient rabbis became so cautious around these ideas, because once a heavenly being carries the name, commands obedience, and possesses authority connected to forgiveness itself, the distinction between messenger and manifestation begins feeling dangerously thin. I found myself imagining the Israelites traveling beneath the desert sky, following the cloud, the fire, the mysterious angel moving before them through the wilderness. Did they understand who this being truly was? Did Moses? Or were they also standing inside a mystery too immense to fully comprehend? The deeper I traveled into these passages, the more I felt that the Bible itself was quietly preserving fragments of something ancient. Judaism struggled desperately to explain safely. Um, a heavenly mediator, a visible manifestation of divine authority, a being carrying the name itself within him. And somewhere inside those ancient traditions, hidden beneath centuries of theological fear and silence, the shadow of Metatron began emerging more clearly than ever before, not merely as another angel, but as the mysterious carrier of the divine name, walking silently through the wilderness beside Israel. This entire time, the further I traveled into the ancient traditions surrounding Metatron, the more I realized something deeply unsettling. This was no longer simply the story of a mysterious angel hidden inside a few strange biblical passages. The figure I was tracing seemed to stand frighteningly close to the center of heaven itself. And honestly, this was the moment the atmosphere surrounding the mystery changed for me completely. Because until now, I had still been trying to interpret everything through familiar categories: messenger, angel, symbolic presence. But the deeper I went, the less this sounded like an ordinary messenger. It started with the name itself, Metatron, a name so strange, so unlike anything else in Scripture that scholars still debate where it even came from. Some ancient interpreters connected it to the Greek word for one beside the throne. Others linked it to concepts of divine measurement, heavenly mediation, or guardianship before the presence. No one knows with certainty, and somehow that uncertainty only made the mystery feel even older, almost buried beneath layers of forgotten theology and fragmented memory. But one idea appeared again and again across the mystical traditions. Metatron was the being beside the throne, not distant from it, not merely serving somewhere within heaven, beside it. That detail genuinely disturbed me the first time I fully understood its implications. Because throughout biblical imagination, the throne belongs to God alone. The throne represents ultimate authority, sovereignty, divine judgment, eternal kingship. And yet ancient mystical Judaism repeatedly describes Metatron standing terrifyingly close to that authority, sometimes even seated near it. I remember reading those traditions late at night with a strange feeling growing heavier inside me, because suddenly The heavenly world described by the rabbis no longer felt simple at all. It felt layered, hierarchical, almost dangerous, especially within the ancient mystical movement known as Merkaba mysticism. The mystics who pursued visions of the divine chariot throne described in Ezekiel, these were not casual religious thinkers. They were seekers obsessed with ascending spiritually toward the throne room of heaven itself. Through visions, sacred names, meditations, and hidden knowledge, they believed humanity could glimpse realities hidden behind ordinary existence. And within those heavenly visions, Metatron appears again and again, the Prince of the Presence, the heavenly scribe, the mediator nearest the throne. Some texts describe him wearing crowns of divine fire. Others describe his body radiating unbearable light. Many traditions claim he possessed 70 names. 70, not one or two titles. 70 sacred names associated with divine authority, heavenly mysteries, and cosmic governance. I remember pausing when I first encountered that detail, because in ancient thought, names carried power, identity, purpose, authority, and no ordinary angel in Scripture receives anything remotely comparable, not Michael, not Gabriel, not even the seraphim surrounding the throne. Only men receives descriptions this exalted. And then came the line that truly unsettled me. Some rabbis described him as second only to the eternal. I remember physically leaning back after reading that phrase, because suddenly the entire theological tension surrounding Metatron became impossible to ignore. Second only to the eternal, not merely another servant, not simply another heavenly messenger, a being elevated above every other power in heaven, closer to divine authority than any created being should ever stand. And honestly, the deeper I reflected on it, the stranger the entire structure of heaven became. Because once you place a figure beside the throne, carrying divine names, governing heavenly mysteries, standing above angels, the line between servant and manifestation begins feeling terrifyingly thin. I started understanding why ancient rabbis grew so cautious around these traditions, because these were not harmless mystical speculations. These ideas touched the very boundaries of monotheism itself. How close can a being come to God before the distinction becomes almost impossible to maintain emotionally? That question haunted nearly every text I read afterward. And perhaps even more unsettling, the ancient rabbis themselves seemed aware of the danger. Some mystical traditions preserve Metatron with reverence. Others surround him with warnings, almost as though they feared ordinary believers might misunderstand what they were seeing. A heavenly mediator, a visible figure carrying divine authority, a being beside the throne. The atmosphere around these traditions felt less like ordinary theology and more like guarded fire. Sacred knowledge passed carefully between generations, hidden behind symbolic language, visions, and coded names. I found myself imagining ancient mystics ascending through heavenly visions, passing through terrifying realms of fire and angels, until finally approaching the throne itself, and there, standing beside unimaginable divine radiance, Metatron, the Prince of the Presence, the bearer of 70 names, the being beside the throne. At this point in the journey, I could no longer dismiss the possibility that the ancient world was wrestling with something far more complex than modern readers often realize. Because hidden beneath the surface of biblical tradition, ancient Judaism seems to preserve fragments of a mystery too dangerous to speak about openly, a visible heavenly mediator standing astonishingly close to divine identity itself. And the deeper I went, the more impossible it became to escape one terrifying realization. Maybe the rabbis were not afraid because Metatron was insignificant. Maybe they were afraid because he stood too close to the throne. There was one contradiction hidden inside the book of Exodus that I had somehow overlooked for years, even though once I finally saw it, it became impossible to ignore afterward. And honestly, this may have been the moment when the mystery surrounding Metatron stopped feeling like ancient speculation and started feeling woven directly into the structure of the Bible itself. It begins with one of the most famous verses in Scripture. Exodus 33, Moses speaks with God on Mount Sinai, surrounded by cloud, fire, thunder, and unbearable divine presence. And then God says something absolute: no man shall see my face and live. The statement feels clear, final, unquestionable. The face of God is too overwhelming for mortal beings to survive. Humanity cannot endure direct exposure to divine reality. I remember reading that verse countless times growing up, accepting it naturally, almost automatically, because it fit perfectly within the traditional understanding of God's transcendence, invisible, unapproachable, too holy for human eyes. But then, while tracing these ancient patterns surrounding divine manifestations, I stumbled into Exodus 24 again, and suddenly the contradiction hit me like lightning, because only a few chapters earlier, the text describes something almost impossible. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascend the mountain, 74 human beings, and the passage says plainly, they saw the God of Israel, not an angel, not merely a vision. They saw the God of Israel, and somehow they lived. I remember staring at those verses in silence, reading them over and over again, because the contradiction suddenly felt enormous. Exodus 33 says, no man can see God and survive. Yet Exodus 24 says 74 men saw God, ate, drank, and remained alive. How can both passages exist together? And honestly, I couldn't ignore the contradiction anymore. At first, I tried finding simple explanations. Maybe it was symbolic language. Maybe they saw only glory, not God himself. Maybe it referred to partial revelation. But the deeper I looked, the less satisfying those explanations became, because Exodus 24 describes the scene with strange visual detail. The elders see beneath God's feet a pavement of sapphire stone, clear like heaven itself. Feet, a visible form, a manifestation standing before human eyes. The language feels intensely physical, almost disturbingly concrete. And suddenly, I began sensing the same pattern appearing once again beneath the text. An invisible God, yet somehow a visible manifestation of divine presence standing before humanity. The exact tension we encountered earlier with the angel of the Lord, the visible figure carrying divine authority while remaining mysteriously connected to the unseen eternal. I remember feeling a growing sense of unease as these patterns started overlapping inside my mind, because by now, the examples were multiplying. It's 10. The angel in the burning bush, the voice stopping Abraham, the being carrying the divine name, and now a visible manifestation standing upon sapphire before 74 human beings who somehow survived the encounter. The deeper I followed the trail, the more impossible it became to dismiss these passages as isolated anomalies. Ancient rabbis noticed these contradictions too. Long before modern theology tried smoothing everything into neat categories, Jewish mystical traditions wrestled deeply with the idea that the invisible God might reveal himself through visible manifestations. Humanity could actually endure. Some mystical interpretations connected these manifestations to heavenly mediation, to the presence, to the Prince of the Face, and eventually to Metatron himself. That realization genuinely unsettled me, because suddenly Metatron no longer felt like a strange addition imported into biblical tradition from later mysticism. Instead, he began feeling like an attempt to explain tensions already hidden inside Scripture itself. How can God remain invisible, yet appear visibly? How can no man see the face of God and while 74 elders see God and survive? The old rabbis seemed to answer through the idea of mediation, a visible manifestation of the invisible God, not the fullness of the eternal essence itself, but a form humanity could encounter without destruction. And honestly, once I started viewing the passages through that lens, the Old Testament transformed before my eyes. The Bible suddenly felt layered, almost like two realities unfolding simultaneously. The unseen, transcendent God beyond comprehension, and the visible presence moving through history, interacting with humanity, standing upon sapphire, speaking from fire, walking through the wilderness. Again and again, the same hidden structure seemed to emerge beneath the familiar stories. I found myself imagining the 74 elders standing atop Sinai beneath storm-darkened heavens, trembling before impossible sapphire brilliance, staring into divine radiance they should not survive. And yet somehow remaining alive, what exactly did they see? That question would not leave me alone afterward, because if Exodus 33 remains true, if no human being can fully behold the face of the eternal and survive, then Exodus 24 seems to imply something else entirely. That what stood before those elders, though truly divine, was somehow also mediated, visible, approachable, a manifestation of divine presence humanity could endure. And once that possibility entered my mind, the mystery surrounding Metatron became more unsettling than ever before. Because suddenly, the ancient rabbis no longer sounded like they were inventing strange mystical ideas out of nowhere. They sounded like people desperately trying to explain contradictions already embedded deep within the biblical text itself. Contradictions pointing toward a visible divine presence hidden beneath the surface of Scripture this entire time. After discovering the contradiction between Exodus 33 and Exodus 24, I could not stop returning to the mountain in my mind. Sinai no longer felt like a distant biblical location. It felt alive, shadowed, dangerous, almost like a place where heaven itself briefly tore open before human eyes. And strangely, the detail that kept haunting me more than anything else was not the thunder, not the fire, not even the fear of the elders standing before divine glory. It was the sapphire. Because Exodus 24 does something incredibly unusual. It does not merely say the elders saw God, it carefully describes what was beneath him. There was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were, the body of heaven in its clearness. Under his feet. That wording stayed with me for days afterward, because feet imply form, form implies presence, presence implies visibility. And suddenly, the invisible God of Exodus 33 appears visibly before 74 human beings, standing upon sapphire brilliance beneath the heavens. I remember rereading the passage slowly in silence, feeling something deeply unsettling begin forming in my mind. The Bible kept describing someone visible, standing where no created being should stand. And once that realization entered my thoughts, I began seeing the same imagery reappear elsewhere across Scripture, especially in the visions of Ezekiel. Honestly, that was where the mystery became overwhelming for me, because Ezekiel's visions are among the strangest scenes in the entire Bible. Wheels within wheels, creatures covered in eyes, lightning moving through clouds like living fire, a throne suspended above unimaginable radiance, and then at the center of the vision. Ezekiel describes something profoundly disturbing, a human-like figure seated above the sapphire throne, human-like, not abstract light, not shapeless energy, a visible figure. I remember stopping when I noticed the connection. Exodus 24, feet standing upon sapphire. Ezekiel 1, a throne of sapphire beneath a human-like divine presence. The parallels felt almost too precise to dismiss. Again and again, the Bible seemed to return to the same imagery: sapphire, visible form, divine presence, a figure standing impossibly close to the throne itself. And ancient Jewish mystics noticed these patterns long before modern readers ever did, especially within Merkabah mysticism. The mystics obsessed with Ezekiel's throne visions. For them, the throne was not symbolic decoration. It represented the terrifying interface between heaven and humanity, the place where divine glory became momentarily visible. And eventually, those traditions developed the idea of the Shekinah, the visible dwelling presence of God among humanity. That concept genuinely changed the way I read the Bible afterward, because the Shekinah was not understood as the full, incomprehensible essence of the eternal. No human being could survive that. Instead, it represented the manifestation of divine glory entering visible reality, the presence in the cloud, the fire in the wilderness, the glory filling the temple, the radiance standing upon sapphire, a visible manifestation of the invisible God. And suddenly, so many passages I had read my entire life began feeling completely different, because over and over again, Scripture seems to describe moments where God remains transcendent, invisible, beyond comprehension, and yet simultaneously appears visibly before humanity. The contradiction only resolves if some form of mediation exists, a visible manifestation humanity can endure, a heavenly presence standing between divine infinity and mortal perception. The deeper I reflected on it, the more emotionally overwhelming the implications became. Because by now, this was no longer merely about strange verses hidden inside isolated corners of Scripture. A pattern was emerging. The angel of the Lord, the voice in the burning bush, the figure carrying the divine name, the presence standing upon sapphire, again and again, the same mystery kept surfacing beneath the biblical text. A visible divine figure standing where no created being should stand. And honestly, that realization genuinely unsettled me, because ancient rabbis did not treat these passages casually. Some mystical traditions believed the visible presence represented heavenly mediation. Others associated it with Metatron himself, the prince of the presence, the being nearest the throne, the heavenly mediator through whom divine glory becomes visible to creation. I remember imagining Ezekiel standing beneath storm-darkened skies, watching the heavens split apart. Sapphire radiance flooding the world, wheels of fire moving through the clouds, and above them all, a human-like figure enthroned in divine glory. How does someone witness that and not spend the rest of their life trying to understand what they saw? Perhaps that is why these mysteries became so central to ancient Jewish mysticism, because the Bible itself seems haunted by visible manifestations of divine authority. Moments where heaven briefly becomes visible, moments where the invisible God appears through forms humanity can somehow survive encountering, and every time those moments appear, the same strange tension returns, visible yet transcendent, human-like yet divine, near the throne yet distinct from the eternal. The deeper I went, the more impossible it became to dismiss the possibility that ancient Judaism was preserving fragments of something enormous beneath the surface of Scripture. Not a second God, not pagan mythology, but a visible manifestation of divine presence itself, and somewhere within those ancient visions of sapphire, throne fire, and heavenly radiance, the shadow of Metatron seemed to stand silently beside the throne, waiting to be noticed. The deeper I followed the strange trail surrounding visible divine manifestations in the Old Testament, the more I realized something unsettling. This mysterious figure was not appearing only once or twice across Scripture. He seemed to be everywhere. At first, I resisted that conclusion. Honestly, I kept trying to convince myself I was connecting unrelated passages together, forcing patterns where none truly existed. But the further I traveled into ancient Jewish mystical traditions, the more one title kept reappearing beside the mystery. Sar HaPanim, the Prince of the Face. The title alone carries a strange weight when translated slowly, because in Hebrew thought, the face of God was not merely symbolic language. The face represented direct presence, immediate proximity, the unbearable nearness of divine glory itself. To stand before the face of God meant entering a reality no mortal should survive. And yet ancient mystical traditions described this mysterious being as the Prince of the Face, the one who dwells continually before the presence, not visiting occasionally, not appearing temporarily, remaining there, standing eternally before divine glory itself. I remember the first time I truly understood the implications of that title. And honestly, it disturbed me deeply, because by now this figure was no longer behaving like an ordinary angel at all. Ordinary angels deliver messages. They come and go, they appear briefly and disappear again. But the Prince of the Face exists permanently near the throne, continually before God. The atmosphere surrounding these traditions felt increasingly dangerous the deeper I went, especially when I reached Isaiah 63. That passage genuinely changed the emotional direction of the journey for me, because Isaiah describes God rescuing Israel throughout their suffering, guiding them, protecting them, remaining near them through the wilderness. And then comes one strange line buried almost quietly within the text. The angel of his presence saved them. the angel of his presence, not merely an angel sent by God, the angel of his presence. I remember rereading that phrase over and over again because suddenly all the previous patterns began converging into one overwhelming realization: the visible divine mediator, the presence in the wilderness, the angel carrying divine authority, the prince of the face. Again and again, the same mysterious figure seemed to stand behind the events of Israel's history. And honestly, this was the moment I started realizing something truly unsettling. This figure wasn't appearing occasionally. He was everywhere: the burning bush, the pillar of fire, the cloud leading Israel through the wilderness, the divine voice guiding Moses, the presence standing upon sapphire. Again and again, the same hidden structure appeared beneath the biblical narrative. A visible heavenly presence accompanying Israel through nearly every major moment of their story. I found myself imagining the Israelites wandering through endless desert darkness, exhausted, frightened, uncertain whether they would survive another day, and above them, the pillar of fire blazing against the night sky, not merely symbolic fire, but a visible manifestation of divine guidance itself. The same presence Isaiah later describes rescuing Israel, the same presence ancient rabbis associated with heavenly mediation, the same presence mystical traditions eventually linked to Metatron, the prince of the face. And honestly, once I started seeing the connections, the Old Testament stopped feeling like disconnected stories. Instead, it felt like one continuous encounter between humanity and a mysterious heavenly mediator moving quietly through history itself. That realization genuinely changed the emotional atmosphere of Scripture for me, because suddenly, the presence of God in the Old Testament no longer felt abstract or distant. It felt visible, near, walking beside humanity through wilderness, fear, exile, and revelation. And ancient rabbis seemed deeply aware of how dangerous those implications could become. Some mystical traditions described Sar HaPanim almost reverently. Others surrounded the subject with warnings. Because once a being stands continually before divine glory, guides Israel, carries divine authority, and manifests visibly throughout sacred history, the line between messenger and manifestation becomes terrifyingly thin. I remember sitting late at night rereading Exodus and Isaiah side by side, noticing how often the wilderness narratives describe not merely God acting invisibly from heaven, but a visible presence moving before the people, leading, protecting, judging, rescuing. Almost like the Old Testament itself preserves traces of an ongoing divine mediation hidden beneath the familiar stories. And perhaps what unsettled me most was realizing how consistent the pattern actually was. This mysterious figure appears across centuries, across prophets, across wilderness journeys, across visions, always near the presence, always carrying divine authority, always standing astonishingly close to the throne itself. The deeper I went, the less accidental the pattern felt. And honestly, the less this sounded like ordinary angelology at all. Instead, it felt like ancient Judaism was preserving fragments of a far older mystery, a visible presence of the invisible God, a heavenly mediator standing continually before divine glory, a being so exalted, so near the throne, that generations of rabbis struggled desperately to explain him without compromising the absolute unity of God. And somewhere within those ancient wilderness fires, those clouds of glory, those passages describing the angel of his presence, the shadow of Metatron continued appearing again and again, not hidden in isolated verses, but woven quietly through the entire story of Israel itself. By the time I reached the final layer of this mystery, I realized something I never expected when this journey began. The ancient patterns surrounding Metatron were no longer remaining inside Jewish mysticism alone. They were beginning to stretch directly toward early Christianity itself. And honestly, that realization unsettled me more than almost anything else I had encountered so far, because suddenly, the mysterious angel of the Lord, the visible presence, the prince of the face, the being beside the throne, all of it began converging toward a single terrifying possibility. What if these ancient texts had been pointing toward one identity all along? The first time I seriously encountered this connection was while reading the writings of Justin Martyr, one of the earliest Christian thinkers after the New Testament period. Justin was deeply familiar with Jewish scripture, and what fascinated me was how confidently he interpreted the mysterious appearances of God in the Old Testament, not as the invisible Father himself, but as the Logos, the pre-incarnate Christ, the visible manifestation of God before Bethlehem. I remember reading his arguments late at night and feeling an almost eerie sense of recognition, because suddenly the exact same biblical passages I had been tracing through the Metatron traditions appeared again. The burning bush, the angel speaking as God, the divine presence appearing visibly before humanity. Justin looked at those passages and concluded something astonishing. The invisible God could not be seen directly. Therefore, the visible figure appearing throughout the Old Testament must be another manifestation of divine reality. The Logos, the Word, the visible expression of the invisible God. And honestly, once I understood that framework, the parallels became impossible to ignore. The angel of the Lord speaks as God. The Logos reveals God visibly. Metatron carries the divine name. Christ bears divine authority. The Prince of the Presence stands continually before the throne. The Logos exists eternally with the Father. Again and again, the same ancient structure seemed to repeat through different theological languages. I remember staring for a long time at Exodus 3, the burning bush narrative, realizing how differently the early Christians must have read it. The angel appears in the fire. Then suddenly, God speaks from the bush itself. To many early Christians, this was not confusion. It was revelation, a visible manifestation of divine presence before the incarnation. And perhaps what affected me most emotionally was realizing this idea did not emerge centuries later through complicated theology. It appears astonishingly early. The first generations of Christians already believed the Old Testament contained visible manifestations of Christ before his birth in Bethlehem. The pre-incarnate Logos moving through history long before the manger, long before Nazareth, long before the cross. And suddenly, the old rabbinic fear surrounding Metatron began making even more sense to me, because once Christianity connected these visible manifestations directly to Christ, the theological implications became explosive. The angel of the Lord, the visible presence, the Prince of the Face, the heavenly mediator. All those ancient patterns now pointed toward a single visible identity. I found myself imagining ancient rabbis watching Christianity spread across the world, hearing Christians claim that the visible God appearing in the Old Testament was Christ himself, and suddenly realizing why the two powers controversy became so dangerous, because the patterns genuinely existed inside the text. The contradictions genuinely demanded explanation. No man can see God and live. Yet humanity repeatedly encounters visible divine presence throughout Scripture. How do you reconcile those realities? Ancient Judaism answered through mediation, through figures like the angel of the Lord, the Shekinah, Metatron. Christianity answered through the Logos. And honestly, the deeper I followed both traditions, the more they seemed to circle around the same mystery from different directions, a visible manifestation of the invisible God. That realization genuinely stayed with me, because at this point, Metatron no longer felt like an isolated mystical figure hidden in obscure Jewish writings. He felt like part of a much larger theological pattern stretching across centuries of biblical history. A shadow before Christ, not necessarily identical to Christ, but strangely connected. Almost like ancient Jewish mysticism was preserving fragmented anticipations of ideas, Christianity would later proclaim openly the angel of the Lord, the visible presence, the Logos, the Prince of the Face, again and again, the same outline emerging beneath different names. And perhaps what unsettled me most was how naturally the pieces seemed to fit together once the pattern became visible, almost too naturally. I remember sitting quietly after finishing Justin Martyr's writings, staring out into darkness, replaying the passages over and over again in my mind. The burning bush, the sapphire throne, the angel carrying the divine name. the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, and slowly, one terrifying thought began forming beneath all of it. What if the Old Testament had been whispering one identity all along, hidden beneath symbols, visions, divine appearances, and heavenly mediators? One visible presence moving silently through Scripture, waiting centuries for humanity to finally recognize the name attached to the shadow. And perhaps that is why the mystery surrounding Metatron never fully disappeared, because even after the name faded into silence, the pattern itself remained, hidden quietly across the pages of the Bible this entire time. There is one verse hidden inside Genesis that affected me more deeply than almost anything else in this entire journey. Not because it is long, not because it is dramatic, but because of how strangely quiet it feels. Almost as though the Bible itself pauses for one brief moment and whispers something it never fully explains afterward. The verse appears inside Genesis 5, the ancient genealogy stretching from Adam through the earliest generations of humanity. At first, the chapter feels repetitive, almost hypnotic. One name after another, one lifetime after another, and he died again. And he died again. And he died. The rhythm becomes relentless. Generation after generation swallowed by mortality, humanity marching steadily toward the grave. The chapter almost feels heavy with inevitability, every life ending the same way. Dust returning to dust. And honestly, growing up, I rarely paid much attention to these genealogies. Most people don't. They feel distant, ancient, almost mechanical, until suddenly the rhythm breaks. And that break changes everything, because then Genesis reaches the name Enoch. And instead of saying, and he died, the text says something utterly strange. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That was it. 5 words, God took him. I remember the first time those words truly stopped me, because suddenly the entire rhythm of Genesis fractures. Every other man dies, every other generation ends in burial, but Enoch, no death, no tomb, no explanation, just disappearance. And honestly, 5 words changed everything. I remember staring at the passage late at night, rereading the genealogy again and again, feeling a strange chill slowly building in the silence surrounding Enoch's name. Because Genesis almost seems intentionally mysterious here. It refuses to explain what actually happened. Where did Enoch go? Why was he taken? Why does the text avoid describing death itself? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does the Bible never mention a grave? That detail genuinely haunted me. Because throughout ancient scripture, tombs matter deeply. The burial places of Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, Joseph. These locations are preserved carefully across the biblical story. Death leaves traces, but Enoch leaves nothing behind. No grave, no mourning, no final words, almost as though he simply stepped beyond the visible world entirely. The deeper I reflected on it, the stranger it became. Because Genesis does not describe Enoch like a prophet receiving a temporary vision or a righteous man dying peacefully. Instead, it describes intimacy. Enoch walked with God, walked. The wording feels personal, continuous, almost like companionship. And then suddenly, he is gone, taken, removed from ordinary human history itself. I remember wondering how ancient readers must have reacted to that passage. Because even without later mystical traditions, the mystery already feels enormous. One man escapes death entirely. One human being vanishes from earth without entering the grave. Inside a chapter dominated by mortality, Enoch becomes the single exception. And honestly, the emotional atmosphere surrounding that exception feels overwhelming once you slow down enough to notice it, because Genesis almost presents Enoch like a doorway, a fracture in ordinary human destiny, a suggestion that one man somehow crossed beyond the limits binding every other generation. Ancient Jewish traditions became fascinated with Enoch for exactly that reason. Long before the name Metatron appears openly, Enoch already exists as one of the strangest figures in all of Scripture, the man who never died, the righteous one taken into heaven, the human being who walked so closely with God that the normal laws of mortality themselves seem suspended around him. And perhaps what unsettled me most was realizing how little the Bible actually says, just enough to create mystery, just enough to force questions, not enough to satisfy them, almost as though the silence itself was intentional. I found myself imagining ancient rabbis reading Genesis 5 in candlelit rooms, hearing the endless rhythm of death repeated generation after generation, and he died, and he died, and he died, until suddenly, God took him. No death, no burial, no explanation. How could they not become obsessed with that mystery? The deeper I followed the ancient traditions afterward, the more I realized Enoch became far more than a forgotten figure hidden inside a genealogy. He became a symbol of transcendence, an urged race of heavenly ascent, of humanity crossing beyond ordinary existence itself, and slowly, terrifyingly, the traditions surrounding him began evolving into something even stranger, because later mystical writings would eventually claim that Enoch was not merely taken into heaven, he was transformed there, changed, exalted, given a new identity beside the throne itself. An identity the ancient world would come to fear under another name entirely, Metatron. The deeper I followed the mystery surrounding Enoch, the more I realized something extraordinary. Genesis gives us only silence, but ancient Jewish mysticism tried to fill that silence with fire, because for centuries, rabbis and mystics kept asking the same impossible question: what actually happened to Enoch after God took him? And honestly, once I began reading the ancient texts that attempted to answer that question, I understood immediately why later generations became so cautious around them, because these traditions do not describe Enoch simply entering heaven peacefully. They describe transformation, terrifying, overwhelming, cosmic transformation. The most famous of these accounts appears in a mystical text known as 3 Enoch, sometimes called Sefer Hekalot, the Book of the Heavenly Palaces. I still remember the strange feeling that settled over me when I first opened those passages late at night, because the atmosphere inside them feels nothing like ordinary religious writing. It feels like standing too close to something humanity was never fully meant to see. The text describes Rabbi Ishmael ascending through the heavenly realms, passing angels, fire, terrifying celestial guardians, until finally encountering the being known as Metatron. And then comes the revelation that changes everything. Metatron was once Enoch, the man from Genesis, the human being who never died. I remember physically pausing when I read that line, because suddenly the entire mystery surrounding Enoch exploded outward into something unimaginably larger. According to the text, Enoch was taken into heaven and transformed before the throne itself. Not symbolically, literally transformed. The descriptions become almost overwhelming. Fire surrounds him. His flesh becomes flame. His bones become burning coals. His eyes become torches of divine light. Wings unfold from his body. Thousands upon thousands of celestial eyes cover him with heavenly radiance. And above him, a throne is established. A throne beside the presence itself. Honestly, the imagery felt deeply cinematic when I first encountered it, almost too enormous for the mind to process completely. A human being ascending beyond mortality, consumed by divine fire, transformed into something no longer entirely human, standing before the throne at the center of heaven itself. And then the text says God gives him a new name, Metatron. That moment genuinely unsettled me, because names in Scripture matter profoundly. Abram becomes Abraham, Jacob becomes Israel. Names change when identity changes. But Enoch's transformation goes far beyond anything else described in the Bible. This is not merely spiritual elevation, this is heavenly transfiguration. A mortal becoming something terrifyingly close to divine authority itself. The deeper I reflected on these traditions, the more emotionally overwhelming they became, because beneath all the mystical imagery, there is something strangely tragic about Enoch's story. Imagine walking the earth as an ordinary human being beneath ordinary skies, then suddenly being taken beyond mortality itself. No return, no home, no grave, only eternal nearness to the throne. Ancient texts describe angels trembling before Metatron, The transformed Enoch becomes greater than heavenly hosts, the prince of the presence, the heavenly scribe, the being nearest the divine name. And honestly, this was the point where the mystery surrounding Metatron stopped feeling symbolic to me entirely. Because whether or not one accepts the mystical traditions literally, they reveal something psychologically enormous inside ancient Jewish thought. A fascination with the possibility that humanity itself could be elevated beyond ordinary creation. A mortal standing beside the throne, a transformed human participating in heavenly authority. I remember imagining the ancient mystics meditating on Genesis 5, staring at those five strange words. God took him. And slowly, over generations, their imaginations filled the silence with heavenly ascent, fire, wings, thrones, transformation, until Enoch became something more than a biblical figure. He became a bridge between humanity and heaven, between mortality and transcendence, between visible creation and divine presence itself. And perhaps what disturbed me most was how naturally this transformation connected with all the mysteries we had already traced earlier: the angel of the Lord, the visible presence, the bearer of the divine name, the figure beside the throne. Again and again, the same patterns kept converging toward Metatron, almost as though ancient Jewish mysticism had gathered scattered biblical tensions together into one terrifying heavenly identity. I found myself sitting in silence after reading 3 Enoch, imagining the moment Enoch supposedly entered heaven, the heavens opening, wheels of fire turning through infinite darkness, angelic beings surrounding the throne in terror, a human soul ascending upward through unbearable light, then the fire consuming him, transforming him, crowning him, renaming him, until the man who once walked beside God upon the earth becomes the being standing nearest the throne itself, Metatron. And honestly, the deeper I went, the harder it became to dismiss these traditions as simple fantasy, because emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, they seem to preserve something ancient humanity has always longed for: the possibility that a human being might cross the boundary between earth and heaven and survive transformed on the other side. But somewhere within that longing, another darker tension was beginning to emerge, because once a human being stands beside the throne, carries divine authority, and receives heavenly reverence, the line between servant and divinity begins becoming terrifyingly difficult to see anymore. The deeper I traveled into the ancient traditions surrounding Enoch and Metatron, the harder it became to keep treating the story as symbolic theology, because eventually I encountered a title so shocking, so dangerous, that I finally understood why later religious authorities became deeply uncomfortable preserving these ideas openly. Yahweh Hakatan, the lesser Yahweh. Even now, even simply hearing those words side by side creates a strange tension in my mind, because throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the divine name is treated with terrifying reverence. Ancient scribes would purify themselves before writing it. Some traditions avoided pronouncing it aloud entirely, and yet mystical texts connected to Metatron place that sacred reality dangerously close to this transformed human being from Genesis. The lesser Yahweh. I remember the first time I encountered the phrase inside translations of ancient mystical writings, and honestly, I just sat there staring at the screen in silence, because suddenly the entire story surrounding Enoch no longer felt like a strange legend hidden at the edge of Scripture. It felt like a theological earthquake buried beneath centuries of silence. According to these traditions, after Enoch was taken into heaven and transformed before the throne, the Eternal placed divine names upon him, sacred names connected to heavenly authority itself, names associated with judgment, wisdom, power, glory, and presence. Some texts describe 70 names surrounding him, like radiance around a burning crown. Others claim the ineffable name itself dwelled within him. And then came the image that truly unsettled me: a throne beside the throne, not beneath it, not across heaven from it, beside it. The symbolism alone would already be overwhelming, but ancient mystical writers did not treat it merely as symbolism. They described a genuine heavenly elevation, a transformed human standing closer to the divine presence than any other created being, closer than the archangels, closer than the heavenly hosts, closer than any mortal should ever be allowed to stand. And this was the moment the story stopped feeling symbolic. Completely. Because symbolism does not generate this level of fear. The ancient rabbis themselves struggled anxiously with these traditions, trying to preserve them while also containing them, because once a being carries divine names, occupies a throne beside the heavenly throne, and mediates divine authority, the line between servant and manifestation begins feeling dangerously thin. I found myself returning constantly to Daniel chapter 7 during this stage of the journey, because the imagery there suddenly felt deeply connected to everything surrounding Metatron. Daniel describes the heavens opening, thrones appearing, fire flowing like rivers from before the Ancient of Days, millions standing before the heavenly court. And then a mysterious figure emerges from the clouds, one like a son of man. The phrase haunted me the first time I reread it through this lens. Not merely an angel, not merely a spirit, a son of man, human in appearance, yet approaching the throne itself, receiving dominion, authority, glory in an everlasting kingdom. I remember feeling a strange chill while reading the passage slowly, because once again, Scripture seemed to describe a human-like heavenly figure standing impossibly close to divine sovereignty, and ancient Jewish mystical traditions noticed this too. Some connected the Son of Man imagery directly to Metatron, the transformed Enoch, the exalted heavenly mediator, the one elevated beside the throne. The parallels became almost impossible for me to ignore after that. A human being taken alive into heaven, a heavenly transformation, divine names, authority beside the throne, a son of man approaching the Ancient of Days. The same patterns repeating through different texts, different centuries, different traditions. And honestly, the emotional atmosphere surrounding all of this began affecting me deeply, because beneath the mystical language, beneath the fire and heavenly crowns, there remained something profoundly human and tragic about the story. Enoch was once a man who walked with God. And according to these ancient traditions, proximity to divine glory changed him forever. No return, no ordinary life again, no place among humanity anymore, only eternal nearness to the throne. I found myself imagining what that transformation would mean emotionally, standing forever between humanity and heaven, no longer fully belonging to earth, yet never becoming the eternal himself either. Perhaps that is why the title Yahweh Hakatan feels so unsettling. Not because it claims another God exists, but because it suggests heaven once allowed a human being to participate in divine authority in ways later theology became terrified to discuss openly. And the deeper I followed these ideas, the more another connection quietly began emerging from the shadows, the Son of Man. Because centuries after Daniel's vision, another figure would repeatedly use that title for himself, Jesus, again and again throughout the Gospels, the Son of Man. And suddenly, the ancient visions of Daniel, the throne beside the throne, the heavenly mediator, the visible divine presence, the transformed human elevated into glory, all began pointing towards something even larger than Metatron himself, something the ancient world could sense, but never fully explain. And sitting there alone late at night, rereading Daniel beside these ancient mystical traditions, I could no longer shake the feeling that the old texts were circling around a mystery too immense to speak directly, a mystery hidden behind divine names, heavenly thrones, and the terrifying image of a human figure standing impossibly close to the center of heaven itself. The deeper I descended into the ancient traditions surrounding Metatron, the more unstable the structure of heaven itself began to feel, because by this point, Metatron was no longer being described as merely exalted. He was being described as occupying a position so dangerously elevated that later rabbis seemed almost afraid of the implications themselves. Some mystical writings described him as the highest being in heaven beneath the eternal, higher than the archangels, higher than the seraphim, higher than the heavenly princes governing nations and stars. And honestly, That realization unsettled me more than almost anything else I had encountered during this journey, because throughout biblical tradition, angels stand, they serve, they worship, they wait before the throne in absolute submission. But Metatron sits. The first time I encountered that detail, I genuinely stopped reading for several moments because in ancient Jewish thought, sitting in heaven was not a casual image. Kings sit, judges sit, sovereign authority sits. The heavenly hosts stand before the presence in reverence. Yet mystical texts describe Metatron seated near the throne itself, not because he replaced God, not because he ruled apart from God, but because authority had somehow been entrusted to him in ways no other being experienced. I remember feeling a strange heaviness in my chest while reading those passages because suddenly the theological tension surrounding Metatron became impossible to ignore. How close can a being come to God before the line disappears completely? That question would not leave me alone. Ancient mystical traditions describe Metatron wearing a crown given directly by the Eternal himself, a crown engraved with divine mysteries, radiating heavenly fire, carrying authority over angelic hierarchies and cosmic order. The imagery feels almost unbearable when read slowly. A transformed human being from Genesis, crowned in heaven, seated beside the throne, surrounded by angels who remain standing in his presence. And somehow, the rabbis preserve these traditions while simultaneously fearing them. That fear becomes visible inside the texts themselves. Again and again, the writers seem to approach the edge of something they are terrified to define too openly. Because once a heavenly being rises above the archangels, once he bears divine names, once he sits while angels stand, once he becomes the prince of the presence, the boundaries of monotheism begin trembling beneath the weight of the mystery, Prince of the Presence. That title kept echoing in my mind during this part of the journey. Not Prince of Heaven, not Prince of Angels, Prince of the Presence itself, the being nearest to divine glory, the mediator dwelling closest to the face, no man can survive beholding. And the deeper I thought about it, the more emotionally strange the story became. Because beneath all the heavenly grandeur, beneath the crowns and fire and thrones, Metatron remains connected to Enoch, a man, a descendant of Adam, someone born beneath ordinary skies, walking ordinary earth, breathing ordinary air, and yet, according to these traditions, elevated beyond every other created being in existence. I found myself imagining the heavenly hierarchy described in ancient mystical literature. Endless ranks of angels, burning wheels, living creatures surrounding the throne, rivers of fire flowing through eternity, millions standing in awe before the presence, and among them one figure seated, one figure crowned, one figure carrying divine authority in ways no other being dares approach. Metatron. At times, the imagery almost feels too immense for human language itself. And perhaps that is why ancient writers relied so heavily on symbolism: fire, light, sapphire, wings, crowns, because ordinary speech collapses when trying to describe something standing so close to the center of divine reality. But the emotional tension remained undeniable. How close can a created being come to God before the distinction itself becomes terrifyingly difficult to preserve? I think that is the real fear hiding beneath these traditions. Not merely mystical speculation, but theological danger. Because the closer Metatron rises toward divine authority, the more ancient rabbis begin struggling to explain where the boundary still exists. And eventually, according to later rabbinic stories, that tension explodes completely. Some Jewish teachers began worrying that people would mistake Metatron for a second divine power in heaven, a second throne, a second authority, a second manifestation standing beside the eternal. And suddenly, I understood why later religious authorities became increasingly cautious, even defensive, regarding these traditions, because this was no longer simply about angels, it was about the structure of heaven itself, about how divine authority manifests, about whether the invisible God could reveal himself through a visible heavenly mediator without compromising divine unity. And honestly, by this stage of the journey, The story no longer felt distant to me at all. It felt immediate, alive, dangerous even. Because the questions surrounding Metatron are not merely ancient curiosities buried in forgotten texts. They touch something far deeper. Something humanity has wrestled with for thousands of years. How does the infinite interact with the finite? How does eternity become visible without destroying creation? And how close can any being stand to God before human language itself begins breaking under the weight of the mystery? Sitting there alone late at night, surrounded by open books and ancient passages glowing softly on the screen, I realized the tension surrounding Metatron had been building steadily from the very beginning. The angel who spoke like God, the visible presence upon Sapphire, the transformed Enoch, the throne beside the throne, the crowned mediator seated while angels stand. Every layer of the mystery was slowly leading towards something enormous, something ancient rabbis feared, something early Christians believed they recognized. And somewhere ahead, beyond all these shadows and fragments, another name was waiting to emerge from the darkness. There is one story buried deep inside ancient rabbinic tradition that affected me more emotionally than almost anything else I encountered during this journey. Because unlike the mystical visions and symbolic imagery, this story feels painfully human. It is the story of a rabbi who saw too much. His name was Elisha ben Abuya, once respected, brilliant, deeply learned in the Torah, a man trusted among the great teachers of his generation. And yet later, Jewish tradition remembers him by another name instead, Acher, the other one, the apostate, the heretic, the man who crossed a line he could never return from. The first time I discovered his story, I remember feeling an immediate heaviness settle over me. Because beneath the theology and mysticism, you can almost feel the fear trembling underneath the narrative itself. According to ancient rabbinic accounts, Elisha ascended spiritually into the heavenly realms, entering what later mystics described as Pardes, the hidden garden of divine mysteries, a realm few were considered worthy to approach. And there, in heaven itself, he saw something that shattered him. He saw Metatron, seated. That detail matters more than almost anything else in the story. Seated. Because throughout Jewish theology, angels stand before God. They serve, they worship, they wait in awe before the throne. But according to the tradition, Elisha saw Metatron sitting in heaven like a heavenly ruler. And in that moment, the rabbi reached a conclusion so dangerous that later generations would treat it almost like poison. Perhaps there are two powers in heaven. I remember reading that line for the first time late at night, and honestly, I understood why he panicked. Because after everything we have explored together, the fear feels almost inevitable. A heavenly being carrying divine names, a throne beside the throne, authority over angels, the visible mediator of divine presence, the prince of the face, the crowned being seated while angels stand. At what point does distinction become impossible to preserve emotionally? And suddenly, the ancient fear surrounding Metatron became intensely real to me. Not abstract theology, not distant speculation, but existential terror, because Judaism was built upon absolute divine unity, one God, one throne, one ultimate authority. And yet these mystical traditions kept describing a heavenly figure standing so close to divine glory that some ancient readers could no longer psychologically separate the two. That was the danger. Not polytheism in the pagan sense, but something more unsettling. A second visible manifestation of divine authority within heaven itself, a second power. And according to rabbinic tradition, Elisha ben Abuya could not survive what he saw emotionally or spiritually. The story says that after witnessing Metatron seated in heaven, he fell into heresy. The experience shattered something inside him. I kept thinking about that while reading the account, because honestly, the story feels less like mythology and more like a warning about approaching mysteries too immense for ordinary theological categories to contain. And perhaps even more unsettling, the rabbis telling the story seem deeply anxious themselves. You can feel it beneath the surface, because they do not deny that Metatron exists. They do not deny the heavenly visions. Instead, they desperately try to reinforce the boundary between Metatron and the eternal, almost as though the tradition itself is struggling to stop the line from disappearing completely. The emotional atmosphere surrounding the story haunted me for days afterward. I found myself imagining Elisha standing within the heavenly vision, surrounded by impossible light, rivers of fire moving through eternity, angelic beings trembling before the throne, and then seeing one figure seated near the presence, a figure carrying divine authority in ways no other being possessed, a figure associated with the name itself. And in that moment, the rabbi realizes the implications. Two powers in heaven, not two rival gods, but two manifestations of heavenly authority so close together that the distinction becomes terrifyingly difficult to articulate. And honestly, after tracing the mystery of Metatron this far, I could understand why later religious leaders reacted with such urgency, because once these ideas spread, the theological consequences become explosive. The angel of the Lord, the visible presence, the Son of Man, the throne beside the throne, the Prince of the Face, the lesser Yahweh. Every strand of the mystery seemed to converge toward the same dangerous possibility, that heaven itself might contain a visible mediator sharing divine authority while remaining distinct from the invisible Father. And suddenly, I realized something else that deeply unsettled me. This ancient controversy existed before Christianity fully emerged, long before the councils, long before formal Christology, long before the doctrine of the Trinity was systematized. Ancient Jewish mystics were already wrestling with the terrifying possibility of a heavenly mediator standing beside the eternal. That realization changed the emotional weight of the entire story for me, because the debate surrounding Metatron was never merely about angels. It was about the structure of divine reality itself, about whether the infinite God could reveal himself through a visible heavenly presence without compromising divine unity. And somewhere inside that ancient fear, standing in the shadows behind the rabbis, behind the mystical visions, behind the throne room itself, another identity was slowly beginning to emerge, one that early Christians would eventually claim explained the entire mystery all along. The more I studied the ancient rabbinic reactions to Metatron, the more I realized something unsettling. The rabbis were not merely debating theology, they were trying to contain a crisis unfolding inside heaven itself. Because once the idea of two powers in heaven entered Jewish thought, the danger became impossible to ignore. If people began seeing Metatron as sharing divine authority too openly, then the absolute unity of God, the very center of Jewish faith, could begin unraveling beneath the weight of the mystery. And according to one of the most disturbing rabbinic traditions, heaven itself responded violently to stop that from happening. The story says that after Elisha ben Abuya saw Metatron seated near the throne and concluded that there must be two powers in heaven, divine judgment immediately fell upon Metatron himself. Not because Metatron rebelled, not because he challenged God, but because his exalted position had created theological confusion among humanity. The punishment was terrifying. Metatron received 60 lashes of fire. The first time I encountered that image, it stayed with me for days afterward. Not ordinary punishment, fire, heavenly fire. 60 lashes delivered before the heavenly court itself. The symbolism feels overwhelming when read slowly. Because throughout mystical Jewish thought, fire represents divine holiness, judgment, purification, unbearable proximity to eternity. And now, the highest being in heaven beneath the eternal, the Prince of the Presence, the crowned mediator seated beside the throne, is publicly struck before the heavenly hosts. Why? To prove he was not God. That realization honestly disturbed me deeply, because suddenly the emotional atmosphere surrounding Metatron shifted from awe into fear. The rabbis were trying desperately to protect monotheism, and you can feel that desperation inside the story itself. According to the tradition, Metatron's throne is removed, his privilege of sitting in heaven is revoked. The heavenly distinction that made Elisha panic is publicly stripped away. not because the rabbis denied Metatron's greatness, but because they feared what people would conclude if his exalted status remained unchecked. And honestly, I could feel that fear growing in myself while reading these traditions, because after tracing the mystery this far, the tension had become almost unbearable. The angel who spoke as God, the visible presence upon Sapphire, the transformed Enoch, the throne beside the throne, the crowned mediator seated while angels stand, the lesser Yahweh, the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days. Every layer of the story kept pressing against the same dangerous boundary. How do you preserve the absolute oneness of God, while also preserving traditions describing a visible heavenly mediator carrying divine authority? At some point, the rabbis realized they were standing dangerously close to that boundary, collapsing entirely. And so, theological containment began. That phrase kept echoing in my mind while studying this part of the tradition. Containment, not complete denial, not total erasure. Containment. The rabbis do not destroy the Metatron traditions entirely. They regulate them, restrict them, surround them with warnings, almost like handling sacred fire too dangerous for ordinary people to approach. I remember imagining the emotional atmosphere behind these ancient debates. Rabbis gathering quietly after the destruction of the temple, Judaism struggling to survive political catastrophe, theological fragmentation, rising Christian claims about divine mediators and heavenly sons, and beneath all of it, this terrifying mystical figure standing too close to the throne. Metatron became dangerous not because he was weak, but because he was too exalted, too close, too visible, too difficult to separate emotionally from divine authority itself. And perhaps the most haunting part of the story is this: the punishment does not erase the mystery. Even after the lashes, even after the throne is removed, even after the warnings, Metatron remains, still exalted, still near the presence, still carrying divine authority, unlike any other being in heaven. The rabbis managed to contain the implications, but not eliminate them completely. And honestly, that lingering tension is what affected me most emotionally, because the tradition itself feels afraid of its own conclusions, almost as though generations of religious teachers inherited ancient mysteries they no longer knew how to explain safely. The more I thought about it, the more tragic the entire story became. Imagine being a rabbi desperately trying to preserve the unity of God, while also inheriting sacred texts and mystical traditions describing a heavenly figure so glorious that ordinary believers might mistake him for a second divine presence. No wonder fear entered the conversation. No wonder suppression followed. No wonder silence slowly formed around the name Metatron itself. Because some ideas become too dangerous once people begin connecting all the pieces together. And sitting there late at night, rereading the story of the fiery lashes over and over again, I realized something that genuinely unsettled me. The punishment of Metatron was not really about Metatron alone. It was about controlling how humanity understands the relationship between the invisible God and the visible manifestations appearing throughout Scripture. It was about protecting the line between divine unity and visible heavenly mediation, a line that by now, after everything we have uncovered together, was beginning to feel impossibly thin, and somewhere beyond that thinning boundary, another mystery was waiting, one that early Christians would eventually claim solved the entire tension in a way the ancient rabbis feared from the very beginning. As I continued tracing the ancient traditions surrounding Metatron, the mystery slowly shifted from heavenly thrones and divine names into something even more unsettling: judgment. Because eventually, I realized Metatron was not merely described as a mediator of presence or a throne-bearing being near the eternal. Some traditions placed him at the very center of heaven's records themselves: the heavenly scribe, the keeper of divine books, the recorder of human destiny. And honestly, this was the point where the story stopped feeling distant from ordinary human life, because suddenly the mystery was no longer only about angels and heavenly hierarchies. It became about us, about every action, every name, every soul remembered before eternity. Ancient mystical traditions described Metatron as the celestial scribe standing before the throne, recording the deeds of humanity within the heavenly books. The image affected me deeply the first time I encountered it, because there is something profoundly haunting about the idea that heaven remembers everything. Nothing lost, nothing forgotten, every generation, every kingdom, every hidden act preserved somewhere beyond human sight. And strangely, this idea is woven throughout Scripture itself. The deeper I looked, the more often divine books began appearing in the Bible. Exodus 32, after Israel worships the golden calf, Moses pleads before God in desperation, "Blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written." That verse stopped me cold when I reread it slowly. Your book, a heavenly record, a divine registry containing human names, and God answers, "Whosoever hath sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book." The language feels terrifyingly personal, not symbolic. A book, a record, names preserved before heaven itself. And ancient Jewish mystical traditions connected the administration of these heavenly records to Metatron, the heavenly scribe, the prince of the presence, the being nearest to divine authority beneath the eternal. I remember feeling an almost eerie silence settling over me while reading these traditions, because suddenly the mystery surrounding Metatron expanded far beyond the wilderness stories, far beyond Sinai, far beyond the throne beside the throne. This figure now stood at the center of judgment itself. That realization genuinely unsettled me, because throughout ancient thought, scribes possess extraordinary power. Kings rise and fall through written decrees. Empires preserve memory through records. A name written or erased changes destiny. And now, according to mystical tradition, Metatron presides over the heavenly books themselves. The implications felt enormous, especially when I returned once again to Daniel chapter 7. The heavenly court opens, the Ancient of Days takes his seat, fire flows from the throne, and then Daniel says something that suddenly carried completely new emotional weight for me. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. The books, plural, records existing within heaven itself, the image echoes through centuries of scripture, appearing again later in Revelation chapter 20, where humanity stands before the final judgment, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. I remember sitting there staring at those verses, feeling a strange sense of continuity stretching across the Bible like a hidden river beneath the surface. Exodus, Daniel, Revelation, again and again heavenly books appear, divine records, names preserved before eternity, and ancient mystical traditions repeatedly place Metatron beside those records, not merely as a witness, but as the heavenly scribe administering them. The emotional atmosphere surrounding this idea affected me far more than I expected, because there is something deeply intimate and deeply frightening about believing heaven keeps account of human existence. Every generation, every sorrow, every act out of mercy, every hidden cruelty, every forgotten prayer, written somewhere beyond time itself, and standing beside those records, according to these traditions, Metatron. At this stage of the journey, I began understanding why the rabbis grew increasingly anxious surrounding this figure, because Metatron was no longer merely an exalted angel, not merely a mystical symbol. He had become intertwined with the administration of divine authority itself. Presence, judgment, names, heavenly books, thrones, the structure surrounding him kept expanding until it almost touched every dimension of heaven imaginable. And honestly, the deeper I followed the pattern, the harder it became to separate Metatron emotionally from concepts traditionally reserved for God alone. Perhaps that is why the theological danger surrounding him kept growing, because once a heavenly being carries divine names, mediates visible presence, sits near the throne, and participates in judgment itself, the distinction between servant and manifestation begins trembling under unbearable pressure. I found myself imagining the heavenly courtroom described by Daniel, fire surrounding the throne, ancient beings standing in silence, books opening one by one before eternity itself, And beside those records, the mysterious heavenly scribe, a transformed human from Genesis, the man who never died, now standing at the center of heaven's memory itself. There was something almost tragic about that image to me. Enoch, once walking ordinary earth beneath ordinary skies, now eternally connected to the judgment of nations and generations. No return to humanity. No ordinary existence again. Only endless nearness to the machinery of eternity. And somewhere deep inside all these traditions, I could feel another realization slowly forming. Because later Christian writings would also describe a final judgment, heavenly books, and a Son of Man seated in authority. The parallels were becoming impossible to ignore. The angel of the Lord, the prince of the presence, the throne beside the throne, the heavenly books, the Son of Man. Again and again, the old text seemed to circle around the same terrifying mystery. A visible heavenly mediator standing astonishingly close to the center of divine authority itself. By the time I reached the final layers of the Metatron traditions, I realized something important. The rabbis were not simply afraid of mystical speculation. They were afraid of where the logic was leading. Because once all the pieces were placed together, the implications became almost impossible to control. The angel who spoke as God, the visible presence upon Sapphire, the prince of the face, the transformed Enoch, the throne beside the throne, the heavenly scribe, the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days. Every strand of the mystery seemed to converge toward one terrifying possibility, that divine authority might somehow exist in more than one visible manifestation within heaven itself. And this is where the controversy known as two powers in heaven exploded into one of the most dangerous theological crises in ancient Judaism. The first time I truly understood what the rabbis were fighting against, I felt an almost painful tension running beneath the entire history of these traditions. Because the fear was not irrational, the evidence they inherited genuinely was difficult to explain cleanly. Ancient scripture itself contained passages where God appeared visible, passages where the angel of the Lord spoke with divine authority, passages describing a heavenly Son of Man receiving eternal dominion, passages where divine names rested upon a heavenly mediator. And now, as Christianity began spreading across the ancient world, those same passages were increasingly being interpreted through the lens of Jesus. That was the real crisis. The rise of the Christian movement changed everything. Because early Christians openly claimed that the visible manifestations throughout the Old Testament were appearances of the pre-incarnate Christ, the Logos, the Son of God before Bethlehem. Suddenly, the old mystical traditions surrounding Metatron no longer existed in isolation. They became connected to a rapidly growing movement proclaiming that divine plurality existed within the identity of the one God himself. And honestly, after everything we have explored together, I could understand why the rabbis became afraid. Not afraid in a shallow sense, but existentially afraid that the absolute unity at the center of Jewish faith was beginning to fracture beneath the weight of these interpretations. This is where the term Benitarian theology becomes so important, because many scholars now believe ancient Judaism may once have contained traditions describing two distinguishable manifestations of divine authority within heaven. Not two rival gods, not pagan polytheism, but two heavenly powers operating within the divine reality itself. One invisible, one visible, one transcendent, one mediating presence approaching humanity. And suddenly, the old Metatron traditions became explosive. Not because they were new, but because Christianity provided a framework that seemed to connect all the fragments together. I remember sitting alone one night thinking about the emotional pressure ancient rabbis must have felt during this period. The temple destroyed, Rome crushing Jewish resistance, Christian communities spreading rapidly through the empire, and beneath all of it, sacred Jewish texts containing mysterious heavenly figures Christians were now identifying with Christ himself. The tension must have felt unbearable, because if the rabbis fully accepted the implications of the Metatron traditions, they risked validating Christian interpretations of Scripture. But if they denied the traditions completely, they risked abandoning ancient mystical beliefs deeply rooted within Jewish thought itself. And so, suppression slowly began, not complete erasure, but containment. Restrictions around mystical teachings, warnings about dangerous interpretations, careful distancing from the two powers theology, and eventually increasing silence surrounding Metatron altogether. The emotional atmosphere surrounding this suppression genuinely affected me while researching it, because it no longer felt like abstract theological debate. It felt like survival, religious survival, identity survival. The rabbis were trying desperately to protect monotheism from collapsing beneath layers of mystical ambiguity. And perhaps the most haunting realization of all was this: the fear wasn't that Metatron didn't exist. The fear was what people might conclude if he did. That sentence stayed with me long after I finished reading, because by now, the issue was no longer whether ancient Jewish traditions described Metatron. They absolutely did. The issue was what his existence implied: a visible mediator carrying divine authority, a heavenly figure near the throne, a transformed human elevated above angels, a bearer of the divine name, a heavenly scribe participating in judgment itself. How do you preserve strict monotheism once all those elements exist together inside the same theological universe? And honestly, the deeper I went, the more I understood why later generations tried to move away from these mysteries entirely. Because the closer Metatron moves toward divine authority, the more difficult it becomes emotionally, philosophically, spiritually, to maintain a perfectly clean separation between the eternal and his heavenly mediator. Perhaps that is why the old traditions became quieter over time, not because the mysteries disappeared, but because they became too dangerous to discuss openly. And yet, despite all the suppression, despite the theological containment, despite the warnings and silence, the traces never fully vanished. The angel of the Lord still walks through Scripture. The Son of Man still approaches the throne in Daniel. The visible presence still stands upon Sapphire. The heavenly books still open before eternity. The old patterns remain hidden inside the text itself, waiting. And somewhere beyond all these ancient fears and controversies, another question was beginning to emerge from the shadows. What if the rabbis were right to fear where these mysteries ultimately pointed? By the time I reached the final stage of this journey, I realized the mystery surrounding Metatron was no longer simply about one hidden name. It was about silence itself, a very deliberate silence. Because the deeper I studied the history of early Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple, the more I began sensing that something enormous had shifted beneath the surface of religious history. Not all at once, not through one dramatic announcement, but gradually, carefully through canon formation, theological boundaries, editorial choices, and the slow marginalization of texts considered too dangerous to preserve at the center of public faith. And somewhere within that process, the name Metatron slowly faded into the shadows. The first time I began reading about the period often associated with the Council of Jamnia, I honestly did not expect it to affect me emotionally. Historians still debate exactly what happened there, whether it was a formal council or a broader rabbinic movement shaping Jewish identity after catastrophe. But one thing became increasingly clear: Judaism was redefining itself. The temple was gone, Jerusalem devastated. Rome had shattered the old world. And now the rabbis faced an impossible task: preserve monotheism, preserve identity, preserve scripture, while also resisting interpretations increasingly used by the growing Christian movement. And in that fragile atmosphere, certain mystical traditions became deeply uncomfortable to keep near the center of official theology, especially traditions surrounding heavenly mediators, visible divine manifestations, the Son of Man, the angel of the Lord, and most dangerously of all, Metatron. I remember sitting late at night comparing ancient texts that survived on the edges of canon, fragments from Enochic literature, mystical writings, apocalyptic visions, and noticing how often they seem to orbit around ideas later religious authorities treated cautiously or avoided almost entirely. The Book of Enoch especially haunted me, because for centuries, Enochic traditions had clearly influenced Jewish thought. The language of heavenly journeys, watchers, divine judgment, thrones, books of heaven, the exaltation of Enoch, these ideas flowed through the spiritual imagination of the ancient world. And yet, over time, Enoch literature became increasingly marginalized from mainstream Judaism, pushed outward, excluded from the developing canon, preserved only in fragments and isolated traditions. Why? That question stayed with me constantly, because the issue was not that these texts lacked influence. They clearly had enormous influence. The issue was where their theology ultimately pointed, toward heavenly mediators, toward visible manifestations of divine authority, toward transformed human figures standing near the throne, toward mysteries dangerously compatible with emerging Christian claims about Christ. And suddenly, the silence surrounding Metatron began making emotional sense to me. Not because the traditions vanished completely, but because they became too explosive to leave uncontrolled. The rabbis were not merely choosing books, they were stabilizing theology, creating boundaries, protecting monotheism from interpretations they believed could fracture it beyond repair. I found myself imagining ancient scholars copying sacred texts by candlelight, painfully aware that every preserved tradition shaped how future generations would understand God himself, which traditions remain central, which become peripheral, which survive only in whispers. And gradually, Metatron moved further into the shadows, not erased entirely, but surrounded by silence. The mystical texts became harder to access. The dangerous interpretations became restricted. The heavenly mediator traditions became increasingly marginalized. And yet, despite all the containment, the fingerprints remained. That realization honestly gave me chills, because even after the silence, even after the suppression, even after the canon solidified, the old patterns still linger inside Scripture itself. The angel who speaks as God, the presence upon sapphire, the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, the heavenly books, the visible mediator, the throne beside the throne. The traces survive everywhere once you begin noticing them. And perhaps that is what affected me most deeply during this stage of the journey. The realization that religious history is not always about removing ideas completely. Sometimes it is about allowing them to fade quietly into the background, still present, still visible to those searching carefully. But no longer standing openly at the center of public theology, the name disappeared, but the fingerprints remained. That sentence kept echoing in my mind over and over again, because by now, Metatron no longer felt like a random mystical curiosity buried in obscure Jewish writings. He felt like a shadow stretching across the boundary between Judaism and Christianity itself. A shadow early rabbis struggled to contain. A shadow early Christians believed pointed toward Christ. And somewhere within that silence, I began sensing the final stage of the mystery slowly emerging. Because once the old mystical traditions faded from the center of Jewish theology, another figure gradually moved into their place, a visible mediator, a Son of Man, a bearer of divine authority, a heavenly presence seated beside power itself. And the deeper I followed the ancient fingerprints left behind after Metatron's disappearance, the more impossible it became to ignore where they seemed to lead in the end, toward Jesus. At a certain point during this investigation, I stopped asking whether the ancient traditions surrounding Metatron resembled early Christianity, because by then the overlap had become impossible for me to ignore. Every road seemed to lead back toward the same pattern: the Logos, the Memra, the Son of Man, the Angel of the Lord, Metatron, different names, different centuries, different traditions, this, and yet all orbiting around one astonishing idea: a visible mediator of the invisible God. I remember sitting alone late at night with open texts spread across my screen, reading passages from Jewish mystical writings beside the opening verses of the Gospel of John, and feeling a strange tension slowly building in my chest, because the similarities no longer felt accidental. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Logos, the divine Word, the visible self-expression of the invisible eternal. The first time I reread those words after studying Metatron traditions, they felt entirely different, not foreign to Judaism, but strangely connected to older currents already flowing beneath ancient Jewish thought, especially through the idea of the memra. The memra was an Aramaic expression often appearing in ancient Jewish paraphrases of scripture, especially within the Targums. And what fascinated me was how the memra frequently behaves almost like a visible manifestation of God himself. The memra creates, the memra speaks, the memra walks among humanity, the memra reveals divine presence without exposing the unbearable fullness of the eternal directly. And honestly, the deeper I compared the memra traditions with the Logos theology of early Christianity, the more difficult it became to separate them cleanly. Then came the Son of Man, Daniel's mysterious heavenly figure approaching the Ancient of Days, human-like, yet arriving upon clouds, receiving eternal dominion, a heavenly mediator standing near the throne itself. I remember rereading Daniel 7 beside the Gospels, watching Jesus repeatedly call himself the Son of Man, and suddenly feeling the old Jewish mystical patterns reawakening beneath the New Testament. The visible heavenly figure, the mediator, the throne-bearing presence, the overlap was becoming overwhelming. And then, of course, the angel of the Lord. The mysterious figure we traced all the way back through Genesis and Exodus. The being who speaks as God, carries divine authority, receives reverence, appears visibly to humanity, yet somehow remains distinguishable from the invisible Father. The same paradox keeps appearing again and again, different language, different imagery, but the same impossible tension, one invisible God, and yet a visible divine mediator standing before humanity. And every time I reached the edge of that tension, the name Metatron appeared waiting in the shadows again, the Prince of the Presence, the bearer of the divine name, the heavenly mediator, the transformed human exalted beside the throne. At first, I tried resisting the growing parallels, honestly. Part of me feared forcing connections where none existed. But then I began reading academic studies comparing these traditions historically, and the overlap became even harder to dismiss. Many scholars now acknowledge that Second Temple Judaism contained complex traditions about heavenly mediators long before Christianity formally emerged. The idea of a visible manifestation of divine authority was not invented suddenly in the New Testament. It already existed within Jewish mystical imagination. The Memra, divine wisdom, the angel of the Lord, the Son of Man, Metatron. Different streams of thought, yet all circling around a visible expression of divine presence interacting with humanity. And honestly, the emotional impact of realizing this affected me deeply. Because growing up, I had always imagined a sharp separation between ancient Judaism and early Christian theology. But now, the boundary felt far more fluid, far more mysterious. Almost as though Christianity emerged from questions already haunting Jewish theology for centuries. Questions about how the invisible God reveals himself, questions about divine mediation, questions about heavenly figures standing beside the throne. I remember staring for a long time at one particular parallel that genuinely unsettled me. Metatron carries the divine name. Christ says, "I have manifested thy name." Metatron sits near the throne. Christ ascends to the right hand of power. Metatron mediates heavenly authority. Christ declares all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto him. The Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man again and again. The parallels kept accumulating until they formed something emotionally impossible to ignore. And perhaps what disturbed me most was realizing how ancient these questions truly were. Long before church councils, long before formal doctrines, long before medieval theology, humanity was already wrestling with the mystery of how the eternal interacts visibly with creation. And across different traditions, different languages, different centuries, The same shadow kept reappearing, a visible divine mediator near the throne, carrying authority, bearing the name, walking among humanity. The deeper I followed the pattern, the more I felt as though the old traditions were not separate stories at all, but fragments, broken reflections, different generations attempting to describe encounters with the same overwhelming mystery. The Logos, the Memra, the Angel of the Lord, the Son of Man, Metatron, and by now, after tracing all these overlapping traditions through centuries of theology and mysticism, one terrifying possibility kept growing louder in my mind. What if these were never truly separate identities to begin with? What if the ancient world had been reaching toward the same revelation all along, only seeing it through shadows, fragments, and unfinished names before the final name emerged openly into history? The further I followed the ancient threads surrounding Metatron, the more impossible it became to read the words of Jesus the same way I once had. Because suddenly, statements I had heard my entire life no longer sounded isolated. They sounded connected to a much older and much more dangerous theological tension already existing within Judaism itself. I and the Father are one. The first time I reread that verse after studying the Metatron traditions, I felt an immediate weight behind it that I had never fully noticed before. Because within the world of Second Temple Judaism, those words did not exist in a vacuum. The Jews listening to Jesus already knew the language of divine mediators. They already knew the controversies surrounding heavenly figures near the throne. They already feared the possibility of two powers in heaven. And suddenly, the reactions of the Jewish leaders in the Gospels began making emotional sense to me in an entirely new way. Because after Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," the crowd immediately reaches for stones. Not confusion, not curiosity, judgment, blasphemy. That reaction haunted me once I understood the historical background surrounding these ideas. Because the issue was not merely whether Jesus claimed authority, prophets claimed authority. The issue was that his language sounded terrifyingly close to the ancient mystical tensions Judaism had already struggled to contain for generations. A visible divine mediator near the Father, sharing divine authority, and the parallels kept growing stronger the deeper I looked. Jesus forgives sins, something traditionally belonging to God alone. The angel of the Lord carries authority connected to forgiveness in Exodus 23. Metatron carries the divine name. Christ declares the Father's name revealed through him. Metatron sits beside the throne. Jesus speaks repeatedly about sitting at the right hand of power. That phrase especially shook me once I slowed down enough to really hear it. At his trial before the high priest, Jesus says, "From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tears his robes immediately. Why? Because Jesus was combining Daniel 7's Son of Man imagery with enthronement beside divine authority itself, the exact kind of heavenly mediation Jewish leaders already considered dangerously close to the two powers controversy. And honestly, the deeper I looked, the more the parallels stopped feeling accidental. I remember sitting alone late one night reading the trial narrative beside Daniel 7, then beside the Metatron traditions, and feeling almost overwhelmed by how closely the patterns aligned. The Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days, a heavenly figure seated beside divine authority, a visible mediator receiving dominion, a bearer of the divine name, a figure humanity can encounter visibly while remaining connected to the invisible Father. Again and again, the same structure kept appearing, and suddenly, I began understanding why the earliest Christians believed Jesus fulfilled mysteries already hidden inside Jewish theology itself, not replacing Jewish tradition, but emerging from tensions already present within it. That realization genuinely affected me emotionally, because growing up, I had often imagined Christianity and ancient Jewish mysticism as completely separate worlds. But now they felt deeply intertwined, almost as though the old mystical traditions had prepared conceptual space for a visible divine mediator long before Christ appeared openly in history. The Logos, the Memra, the Son of Man, the angel of the Lord, Metatron. All these streams seem to converge toward the same overwhelming possibility. And perhaps what disturbed me most was how intensely the Jewish leaders reacted whenever Jesus spoke in ways touching those ancient tensions. Not merely because he taught morality, not merely because he performed miracles, but because his claims sounded dangerously close to divine participation itself. Participation in authority, participation in judgment, participation in heavenly enthronement, participation in the name. I kept returning emotionally to the phrase, at the right hand of power. Because in ancient Jewish imagination, the throne represented ultimate sovereignty, and now Jesus openly places himself beside it, not beneath it, beside it. The same terrifying proximity that made the Metatron traditions so dangerous, and suddenly the old rabbinic fear surrounding two powers in heaven felt more understandable than ever before. Because from their perspective, these ideas threatened the absolute simplicity of divine unity itself. A visible mediator near the throne, sharing authority, bearing the name, the very same patterns Judaism had spent centuries trying to contain, now appeared openly in the words of Jesus himself. And honestly, by this point in the journey, I could no longer dismiss the possibility that the ancient Metatron traditions and early Christian theology were touching the same underlying mystery from different directions, not identical, but connected. Like fragments of one enormous reality humanity struggled to describe adequately. The deeper I looked, the more I realized the Gospels themselves are filled with echoes of the old heavenly mediator traditions, the Son of Man, the visible image of the invisible God, the bearer of divine authority, the enthroned heavenly figure beside power itself, and sitting there in the silence, rereading the words of Christ beside the old mystical texts, I felt a strange realization slowly settling over me. Perhaps the ancient rabbis were not wrong to fear where these ideas could lead, because once the parallels become visible, they become very difficult to unsee again. By the end of this journey, after tracing shadows through Genesis, Sinai, Daniel, Enoch, the throne visions, the angel of the Lord, the Son of Man, and the ancient fear surrounding Metatron, I found myself sitting in silence with one overwhelming realization slowly settling over me. Perhaps none of these traditions were ever random. Perhaps they were fragments, echoes, foreshadowings, shadows cast backward across history by something humanity could sense long before it fully understood. Because the deeper I followed the mystery, the more Metatron began feeling less like the final answer and more like a shadow pointing toward one. A shadow of mediation, a shadow of visible divinity, a shadow of heaven reaching toward humanity without destroying it. And honestly, once that realization entered my mind, the entire Bible began feeling different. Not disconnected books, not isolated stories, but one long unfolding pattern hidden beneath centuries of revelation. The angel who speaks as God, the presence upon sapphire, the name dwelling within him, the Son of Man approaching the throne, the heavenly mediator beside power. Again and again, the Old Testament seems to circle around the same impossible tension. How can the invisible God become visible to humanity? How can eternity touch creation without consuming it completely? And ancient Judaism answered that tension through fragments. The Memra, the angel of the Lord, the Prince of the Face, Metatron, different names attempting to describe encounters with divine mediation. But the New Testament makes a far more direct claim, not another shadow, not another symbolic manifestation, but fulfillment. The Word became flesh. The first time I reread that verse after everything we have explored together, I genuinely felt chills because suddenly the old mysteries stopped feeling unfinished. The visible mediator, the heavenly Son of Man, the bearer of divine authority, the enthroned figure beside power, all of it converges into one person, Jesus. And perhaps what affected me most emotionally was realizing that the earliest Christians did not seem to believe they were inventing an entirely new idea. They believed they were revealing what had been hidden in fragments all along. The Logos made visible, the invisible God manifested in human form, the final unveiling of patterns already whispering through ancient scripture for centuries. I remember sitting quietly one night after finishing my research, looking back through all the passages we have followed together, and feeling something almost impossible to describe. Not certainty, not triumph, something quieter. A strange sense that the ancient world itself had been searching for language large enough to describe encounters with divine presence, and every generation came close, but never fully arrived. The rabbis sensed the mystery. The mystics described the throne, the prophets saw the Son of Man, the ancient texts preserved fragments of heavenly mediation, but the names kept shifting. Angel of the Lord, Memra, Metatron, Prince of the Presence, until finally Christianity made the most radical claim of all, that the mystery had entered history openly, not merely through visions, not merely through heavenly appearances, but through a person, a man who walked among humanity, spoke with divine authority, forgave sins, claimed unity with the Father, and sat beside heavenly power itself. The deeper I reflected on all of this, the more one truth kept lingering quietly in my mind. The ancient rabbis may have been right to fear where the mystery pointed, because once the patterns become visible, they seem to lead relentlessly toward Christ, the visible manifestation, the final mediator, the fulfillment of the old shadows. And suddenly, Metatron no longer feels like the conclusion of the story. He feels like a foreshadowing, a symbolic anticipation, an unfinished reflection of a greater revelation still to come, a heavenly figure carrying divine authority, preparing human imagination for the possibility that one day the invisible God might fully reveal himself within visible human form. Perhaps that is why the parallels never disappear completely, because the old mystical traditions and the New Testament are wrestling with the same ancient longing to see the face no one can see and survive. I kept returning emotionally to the image of Sinai, 74 elders standing before the sapphire brilliance of divine presence, somehow alive in the impossible tension between visibility and transcendence. And then I thought about Christ, the image of the invisible God, the Word made flesh, the visible manifestation humanity can finally approach without destruction. And slowly, the entire mystery surrounding Metatron seemed to settle into place inside a much larger story. Not the final revelation, but the shadow before it. Not the destination, but the echo of something greater moving toward humanity through centuries of symbols, visions, prophecies, and heavenly mysteries. And perhaps after all these generations of searching through sacred texts and hidden traditions, after all the fear, all the suppression, all the whispered names surrounding the throne, maybe the ancient world had been searching for the right name all along. And maybe the final name was never hidden, only misunderstood.